Good morning. Okay, that was a little dry. Let's do it again. It's wet outside, but it's dry in here. Let's try it one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Awesome. My name is Waller-Bey. As Denise mentioned, I'm so excited to be with you all today, with also my fellow panelists, and we all will be kind of telling our stories in our own way. We have limited time together. The clock is already counting down, so we'll get started. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about my story and my journey. So again, I'm Aya Waller-Bey. I'm currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. And I'm super excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about my research. And I study trauma narratives and college admissions essays, but more importantly, I talk about the ways in which our stories are often used, leveraged, commodified, and sometimes exploited, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do and connect this to my personal story, my professional story, and also my academic story. So to begin, you see this photo here of baby Aya, class of '98, graduating from Head Start. And I'll say this, as a first-generation college student, I was often identified as a very high-achieving student. As early as kindergarten and Head Start, I was reciting Langston Hughes poetry, and I had a lot of educators in my life tell me like something is special about this young person. And I've always taken a love for learning and literature and read encyclopedias, the stereotypical story of the little nerd. That was me. However, I often felt like my educational experiences, so the way that I thrived in the classroom, my ability to overperform in a lot of ways was in contrast with my lived experience in my reality. So as I mentioned, I was first-generation college student, so first person in my family to go to college. I was the middle child of 5, so a very decent-sized kind of family. But we lived in a very under-resourced community in Detroit, Michigan, which is where I live now. So the photo next to my graduation picture is the duplex that my family lived in right before I went to college at Georgetown University. It is abandoned in the photo. It was not, of course, abandoned when we lived there, but often I was, again, going to the classroom, thriving class president, the overachiever, all-A student, while returning home to a very difficult lived environment. As I got older, so in high school, I participated in a lot of different programs, a lot of college access programs, again, for under-resourced students. And there was one program in particular, it was a free 7.5-week program at Princeton University where they flew us out and we got to live our best lives. I got to meet other talented young people from across the country, but they also provided college advising. So in this program, when we were working on our college essays, I wrote an essay called Jumping for Joy. And I still have, I'm one of those people who save everything, so I still have access to it. And I wrote this essay called Jumping for Joy. And it was about when I got accepted into the program. I was excited, I was elated, and I was literally jumping for joy. And when I gave the essay to the advisor of the program, she said, this essay may work for some of those other schools on your list, but the types of schools you're applying to, so the very selective, the Princetons and Georgetowns and all those places, she said, I need something more compelling. So the word compelling at the time, I didn't have the literacy and the competency that I had now to understand what that meant. But the word compelling signaled that there was a particular type of way I had to talk about my identity and my lived experiences to make me palatable, to make me legible in the college admissions process. And that really sparked something in me. So when I applied to college, there were very specific signaling happening that told me that, again, my lived experience, there was a particular way to talk about my identity, right? And in 2021, a high school senior by the name of Elijah Megason published an op-ed in the New York Times. And in this article, he mentions that he was told, you're smart, you're from the hood, you're from the projects, colleges will love you. And that's super interesting because I received very similar messages when I applied to college, right? That I had this trifecta of low-income, first-generation college student from the hood of Detroit, and that colleges will love you. They will love this story about your identity. And this was despite my other academic accomplishments. I was class president and model unit, all the stuff that you could think about that young people participate in. I was that student. But there was something less palatable about my academic excellence. My story of struggle and hardship and trauma, I was told, was the most important thing. And interestingly enough, I am not the only person who maintains this this position. So here on the slide, you'll see several tweets from students who've kind of posted about this, a similar kind of encouragement, if you will. So you'll see things from, every time I read a graduate school application, a person of color mentions childhood trauma, or, the fact that we have to pimp out our trauma and essays to get in is sad. So that is something that I've seen in my own work. I saw when I was an admissions officer and coordinator of multicultural recruitment, that there was something very specific about the types of stories that students, and particularly racially minoritized students, felt like they had to tell to get in, right? This last one with Cynthia's, it's funny. Colleges really expect me to write some poor minority first-gen trauma porn from them in these essays. So you'll see, again, there was this expectation that this is the narrative they have to tell. And you'll see even students, like the tweet in the, it's in my upper right corner, but where the student talks about 4.0, had a two-sport athlete valedictorian, but again, feeling coerced to talk about their incarcerated dad. Next slide. So given this, as I mentioned, I just finished my 5th year in my PhD program in sociology at Michigan. And I have several questions that I'm pondering for my dissertation, but again, for the sake of time, I'll talk about this one where I investigate under what conditions are Black students, or undergraduate students in particular, enrolled at historically and predominantly white institutions, so like Yale, but also historically in Black colleges and universities, such as Howard University in DC, fulfill, subvert, or reject these expectations to talk about trauma. Right? So one thing that you'll notice is the premise is it's happening, right? Again, when I worked as an admissions officer, I saw it firsthand. I felt like the white students and the affluent students in the applicant pool were able to talk about their passions, but I felt a lot of the low-income students, the racially minoritized students, talked about their pain. And I wanted to know from where did that disparity stem? So some of the findings, again, I can be here all day talking about my research, but again, for the sake of time, I'm going to do just an overview. So some of the things that I learned in my research, again, is that admissions essay prompts are inviting students to discuss aspects of their identity and backgrounds in a variety of ways. So not all essay topics are asking students to say, talk about your trauma. There might be an question that asks, which is the case for the common application, it may ask you to say, talk about someone who inspired you. That could be anybody, that could be Oprah, that could be, Betty, that could be anyone, right? And yet students are talking about the most devastating, heart-wrenching moments of their lives. Why is that? So my students talked about that there was a resounding message that they received from universities, teachers, college counselors, social media, so the TikToks and Instagrams and the Twitters, that said they needed to write about their ability to overcome hardship. And then specifically, the Black students faced a racialized expectation. So it wasn't just talk about your hardship as someone who struggles, because all humans, everyone here has to struggle, right? We've all overcome something. But they felt it was something specific to their racial identity, that they were linked to their trauma, that to be Black meant that you therefore had to have some struggle or trauma in a way that was very flattening, in a way that perpetuated or reinforced racial stereotypes, in a way that they felt were harmful. So when I interview my undergraduate students, and I particularly love this young person, Dominic, when I ask them, just blankly, what do you think universities want to see? What do they want to read? I mean, Dominic was very explicit. The only thing at that point I thought they were looking for is for you to pour your trauma out on the page, right? And it's just interesting that is how Dominic made sense of the expectations about how to tell his story. Pour my trauma out on the page. And naturally, it's like, who told you to do that, Dominic? Like, from where did that message stem? And Dominic was interesting because he had a teacher in his high school who had a binder of exemplars. So students who had gone to Princeton and Yale, and their essays, trauma, all of them. And he said, okay, that's my expectation. However, so, first we have expectations, and then we have how do students respond to the expectation? Because we all encounter expectations in our everyday life. It's what do we do with those expectations? And I found that my students had 3, if you will, responses or strategies to engaging these expectations. And the first was playing the game. So the first were the students like Dominic, who said, you want trauma, I'm gonna give it to you. So that was Dominic. And then I have my double dipping students who say, okay, the university says they want this kind of student. This is the kind of student I am. I'm gonna give you both. I'm gonna double dip. And then last but not least were my resisting students. And these are students who resisted the expectation to disclose trauma or struggle. These students were committed to telling their stories, on their own terms. And that was regardless if they appealed to the sensibilities of universities and teachers and counselors, right? They say, I'm going to tell the story about creating the video game because that's the story I want to tell, right? And I think that was incredibly important. You also notice the resisting box is taller and bolded, and that's because to my own, what was very surprising in this work is the majority of the students I encountered in my research resisted the expectation. My assumption was everybody played the game. That was my assumption. We all do it, right? The stories we find most appealing often on social media. I mean, I remember watching American Idol, and it's like, meet John, and John is walking down an abandoned, the street is abandoned, and the dog is following him, and it's a sob story, and they have that sad music. So those stories are the ones that appeal to us naturally, right? We want to root from the underdog. We want to see people pull up, themselves by their bootstraps. We love meritocracy in this country. We love individualism. So I thought that those were the stories that people wanted to read or to write about. And my students say, no, I am resisting that expectation. So as I kind of end some of my remarks, one thing that my students really taught me, and this is the most beautiful part about, going through a sociological kind of inquiry and really getting to learn from your participants, because what they reminded me is the beauty of resisting these expectations to talk about joy, right? To be able to speak, honestly about their lived experiences in a way that prioritizes their own joy, their own self-discovery, right? And how that can also operate as an act of resistance. There was one student who talked about going to the inauguration in DC, Obama's inauguration, and how that literally changed her whole desire to pursue political journalism, and how she really wanted to be able to tell these stories of these incredibly important moments. And that was life-changing for her. And that's what she chose to write about. She said, I know I have this background, but I don't want to write about that. I want to write about this moment, going to DC and experiencing this inauguration, and how life-changing and transformational that was for me. And then you have, students who are, again, if you ever just sit and talk to some high school students or some college undergrads, I'm telling you, they are a hoot. I'm not much older than them, but anyway, but they mentioned, they were very adamant about, I don't need to tell you my whole story. I am here and that's enough. And it was this really salient and really important point about what do we owe to other people about ourselves and our identities? Why can I not highlight this very, specific part of myself? Why is there an expectation that to have a certain identity, to be low income or to be first gen or to be Black, that I must contort myself and fit into your narrow expectations, your narrow fictions of who you think I am? And my students did, I think, an incredible job really showing me, really teaching me the importance of, prioritizing the story of self, having agency in the ways that we tell our stories. So with that, I want to really thank you all for joining us today and for listening to my remarks, and I'm going to pass over the conversation to Betty. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you. My name is Betty Bajek, and I'm thrilled to be a panelist here today representing AARP Connecticut. Some of you know that AARP is the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering Americans age 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. And for the most part, we advocate for the 50-plus population. However, that paradigm is changing as now AARP is getting more and more involved in every single generation. But before I go on, I do need to make this statement. I am a volunteer with AARP Connecticut. I do community outreach and I do advocacy, but I do not sell insurance. So where did it all begin? Well, back in 1947, Ethel Percy Andrus, who was a retired California principal, made a shocking discovery. She looked for one of her former teachers and found her living in a chicken coop, unwell, and without medical coverage. And so Ethel got mad, and then she got organized. She decided that this teacher needed some medical care, and she started with over 40 companies who turned her away, but she persisted until she got it done. And now she decided that it wasn't just this one teacher, it was all retired teachers. Oh, but it wasn't just all retired teachers, it was everyone who needed this help. And that's when she founded AARP back in 1958. And just think about that. That was at least a decade before Medicare came out. So Ethel was a forerunner. So advocacy, part of advocacy is we wear our red shirts very proudly up at the state capitol as we're advocating for any of the legislation that AARP supports. We do provide testimony, which means that people tell their story of how this is going to affect them. Because storytelling is a very effective tool. For example, there was one lady who testified and said, you know, I couldn't afford my prescription, so I left the pharmacy and went home to die. Well, AARP, again, led the effort to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, and we won. So millions of Americans now have reduced cost for their medication. One of the things that we're working on is paid family caregivers to get paid, because there's, in the state of Connecticut, over 400,000 family caregivers who do not get paid. And I think that, you know, equating that to some kind of monetary equivalent is like in the millions, maybe even billions. But we haven't crossed the finish line on that. That's still in legislation, and hopefully they'll pick it up again in the next session. But former First Lady Rosalind Carter said, there are only 4 kinds of people in the world. Those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will need caregiving, and those who will be caregivers. So this quote is very powerful, and it helps us recognize that we are all on a caregiving journey in one way or another. So that's the advocacy side of it. But on the outreach side of it, we present programs such as our Fraud Watch program, and that's to help people recognize and be aware of potential scams and not falling victims to them. We have a hotline that if anybody is scammed, they can call the hotline, and they'll first of all, they'll get a person who actually answers the phone, and then they'll actually get some help. We do the Caregiver Roadshow, which provides resources and additional forms of support for family caregivers to create an environment where people can choose to live in their home and communities for as long as they choose to. It also impresses upon the audience that you, the caregiver, need to take care of yourself first. Because if you're not taking care of yourself first, you can't take care of anybody else. And then the Road to Livability provides tips for making home improvements as you age. Things like putting grab bars in your shower, or putting ramps to get into your house. And discusses the type of services available to help residents maintain their independence as they age. But the work that I am most passionate about is the disrupt aging. So a couple of years ago, our CEO, Joanne Jenkins, wrote a book called Disrupt Aging. She had been to her 50th birthday party and received cards like, get the fire extinguisher out to put the candles out, and 60 is the new 40. And she said, you know, I'm only 50 years old. I still have half my life. I can be productive in my community. And so this really started a movement that invites us to challenge our outdated beliefs about aging, and to rethink the negative stories that we tell ourselves and each other about growing old. To stop perpetuating the stereotypes, and to see older adults as multi-dimensional individuals. And now, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion oversees the suite of Disrupt Aging programs. So we have Disrupt Aging Classroom, Disrupt Aging Community, and we're working on Disrupt Aging in the Workplace. But the first program was developed right here in Connecticut. We worked with a gerontology group called Borrow My Glasses. And we present this, it's a 6-hour course. We present it at universities and colleges across the country. We do it in a hybrid, or we do it in person, or we do it virtually, especially during the pandemic. Now I can say that I've been to Alaska, but virtually. But, why do we do this? Well, part of your college education is to expose people to a broad range of ideas, and AARP believes that students need to know something about aging and that it could help them in their career and in their life. So we talk about the aging trend. Back in 1900, the number of people aged 65 and over was about 3 million. And now fast forward to today, where there's about 56 million people, and the average age is about 76. Back in 1900, it was only 47. That's what people could expect to live till. So despite the pandemic, we're still experiencing tremendous longevity, and this is unprecedented, and it impacts our lives in major ways, so bringing challenges and opportunities. Now, it's easy for middle-aged people to think of aging as something far in the future, something you don't have to worry about for decades. In reality, the aging trend is already impacting everyone more than they realize. So if you're willing to consider the aging trend now, you'll have a major advantage extending beyond you, your career, your family, and the communities that you care about. Part of this, one of the factors such as race, gender, geographic location, among others, have impact on longevity. And looking at the impact of race and ethnicity on longevity reveals significant disparities between demographic groups, disparities which already disproportionately impact Black Americans and has only grown since 2020. It has everything to do with socioeconomic factors such as income and education, but disparities also play out based on location in terms of unequal access to good schools, clean air, safe cities, healthy food options, health care, and adequate housing and employment opportunities. Another disparity is the decline in births. Soon there will be more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 18. Now, a key factor in disrupt aging is ageism. And Dr. Robert Butler introduced that term back in 1968. Ageism is the process of systemic stereotyping or discrimination against people because of their age. You'll notice that the definition doesn't talk about older adults exclusively, so everyone can be a target of ageism. And there's ageism in the workplace, in healthcare, in media, against younger people. We were talking about this in class, and I asked the students, has anybody ever do they feel that they've had ageism? And one student raised her hand and she said, I was going on spring break and I wanted to rent a car and I couldn't because I'm not 25. Another student said, I want to live off campus this year and my father is going to pay the rent, but the landlord would not rent to me because I was not 21. Being a member of AARP, that automatically people assume that you're older. And people also have self-ageism, like, I'm too old to wear that. And being invisible. Healthcare professionals sometimes don't speak to the patient, they speak to the caregiver. And ageism can hold us back, limit opportunities, options, and creative thinking, and foster negative perceptions about aging that impact us negatively. The impact of ageism is quite real and can affect us whether we are 25 or 75. Because of this, we believe that everyone has a stake in understanding and addressing ageism to create a more equitable future for all. I don't know if any of you know about Ashton Applewhite, but she has a great TED Talk about ageism. And she touches on how ageism is related to other forms of discrimination. But one theme of her work is that ageism is a form of prejudice against our future selves. Negative feelings about aging often reflect negative attitudes about ability and reflect some of the biases against people who do have disabilities. People age 65 and older are often thought of as just one big group and seen in a negative light. But people age 65 to 74 have a very different experience than somebody who's 75 to 80 or 80 to 100. And so we need to break the myth that all older adults are pretty much the same. Because think about it. From age, you're a baby to age 20, you're not just lumped into one group. You know, you're a baby, then you're preschool, then you go to elementary school, you go to middle school, you go to high school, you go to college. You know, you have your terrible twos and you have your teen years. But they tend to take people who are 65 and older as just one big group, and we're not. Another misconception is the stereotype that people aren't looking forward to aging. But with age comes diverse experience, knowledge, and often more financial resources. Some adults are super seniors, which that's more than just being athletic. A super senior could be somebody who's a researcher. They could be somebody who's published a book, started a new business, or lead change in their community. But on the flip side of that, you have people who are vulnerable, perhaps due to some physical illness, cognitive issues, challenging financial situations. Maybe they don't feel safe in their neighborhoods, or maybe they need assistance with day-to-day activities. So it's possible to be vulnerable, need some help, but still have a lot of joy. Therefore, older adults can be both a super senior and vulnerable. The way you take care of your body and brain now impacts how you age. The diseases we see in old age have roots in youth and middle age. You don't wake up one day at 87 and have heart disease. That's something that has been building over time. Dr. Becca Levy and her associates right down the street here at Yale did a lot of research, and they say that if you have positive perceptions about aging when you're young, you could live approximately 7.5 years longer than somebody who has negative perceptions. So changing from a negative attitude to a positive attitude about aging can add time to your life. And it doesn't just affect the quantity, but it affects the quality of life. Some of you may remember Mickey Mantle. He was a great baseball player, played for the Yankees. People in his family, particularly the men in his family, didn't live past 40 or 45. And so when he was in the hospital needing a liver transplant, somebody said to him, "Do you regret what you've done?" Because he lived hard, because he thought he was going to die at 45. And here he was 60 years old, and he said, I regret it. If I knew I was going to live this long, I would have taken care of myself. So there's a lot to think about here, and I think the underlying idea here is that aging exacerbates existing disparities in some very interesting and upsetting ways. But ageism can impact anyone at any age, and all of us have a role to play in calling that out. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Mike.
Hi, y'all. What? Hi. I love you up there. Hi, my name's Mike Keo. Let's see. I've been thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, and hearing, the conversation about visibility and joy as resistance. I think what I want to tell you is that I founded this I Am Not a Virus campaign in the middle of the pandemic when anti-Asian violence was starting to rise. Today is 41 years since the death of Vincent Chin. His death was yesterday. It's been 41 years. He was an Asian American that went to a bar, Chinese American, and was blamed for outsourcing. And it was the night before his wedding, and he was beaten to death. So all the guests came for a funeral instead. I think about, and this violence doesn't happen. Like, it doesn't happen once every generation. It happens all the time. It happens every 5 years. I can think about 1989 with the Stockton children. It was one of the first mass shootings at a school ground. Young Southeast Asian children that looked like me were gunned down in public, right? I remember my mom asking me at that time to run and duck from bullets at night when I was probably 6 or 7, right? And but I had no clue why we were having this conversation. And I think about, so I started a portrait series where I asked Asian Americans in Connecticut to come in, Southeast Asian Americans, queer, LGBTQIA+, adoptees, multiracial Asian Americans, all of us who has felt the impact of anti-Asian violence, but are often invisible, without the language to describe what we were feeling. And I took portraits of people in their best lights, smiling, happy, joyous, and I asked, if you are not a virus, then who are you, and what do you love about yourself? This led to me co-founding Make Us Visible in Connecticut, which was built upon social equity, inclusive education in K-12. We passed a bill in Connecticut to teach Asian American history in K-12 education. Connecticut also has the most inclusive education with Black, African American, and Latino studies, Holocaust studies. So I'm super proud of that work. This got me onto the Governor's Hate Crimes Advisory Council and named 40 Under 40 in Connecticut by Connecticut Magazine. You know, and I think about the stories that how we tell stories matters. Recently, my younger brother got into the Hartford Courant, made the front cover for his business. We were the 2 eldest in our family, which meant that my parents were always working. I come from a refugee household where we lived in about 6 or 7 apartments before I was 16. So one of my superpowers is moving a bed up 2 flights of stairs, right? I have 2 younger siblings that grew up that are 10 and 12 years younger than us. And my siblings grew up middle class, which meant that they had the 2-week vacations, that they had summer camps. And my brother, my older brother, who's 2 years younger than me, 35, and I'm 38. He turns 36 next month. And we were the ones that were the primary caretakers because at that time my grandma was too old. I was raised by my grandmother. You know, I was raised by my grandmother while my parents were always working. They worked overtime. You never saw them, so it was my grandmother that raised us. And we lived 7 people to an apartment. And I could tell as we got older, my parents regretted the way we were raised, right? We had 3-day vacations. July 4th, July 5th, July 6th, we'll be in Canada, and we'll be back home before work started. And, you know, this story isn't uncommon. I know so many people that have experienced this. We lived 7 people to a household, so we learned to lie to the census people because we're afraid that they were going to take us out and separate our family. Because how could 7 people live in a 1-room apartment? And so my brother gets into the Current last week, or 2 weeks ago, for his donut shop. He's opening a tea and donut shop. I was in the Current 2 years before for my work on anti-Asian violence. And I thought about the arc of my parents' story, coming as refugees, fleeing war, and how little I knew about them, besides that they worked, and that they were always working. And I didn't think I was going to share this. So this reality is an impossible reality. And oftentimes I hear that this is the American dream. You made it, that we made it. To me, that's a story of shame, of resistance, and extreme luck. Right? If I was a photographer and I didn't photograph my community, I would still be invisible. If my brother wasn't in the restaurant industry, he would be invisible. Right? There are so many more of us that don't get those opportunities or those places. And when we're in these spaces where we can share our stories, it's oftentimes the story where our our struggles are seen as trials and tribulations. I would have loved it if I had time with my parents when I was younger, right? And I see my parents making it up to my kids. My kids are always over, they're watching my children, and they're in retirement. And so my work right now works in intergenerationally and cross-racially. I run a program for Asian American and Black youth to be able to share their stories in a way that's comfortable to them and with mentors that reflect them, right? And when we think about the type of work that I do towards moving it towards some kind of justice or some kind of equity, is that our stories need to be shared, especially together. There's a story about my parents. When I was younger, I was accused of plagiarizing all the time. All the time I was accused of plagiarizing. And my mom was like, "You're smart." So I was an average student. You know, I just liked writing. And so this whole narrative became I was smart. And one day I am sitting there and I am the official story for the Health Disparities Institute, UConn's Health Disparities Institute for the Boys and Men of Color Conference. And I'm sitting across from my friend Ty. And Ty is one of the partners on our Asian and Black program. And Ty shares the story about how he was accused of plagiarizing often. Ty is a Black man. You know, he was an athlete, a star in the football field. But inside the classroom, he was always accused of cheating. From elementary school all the way to college, right? And his mom and his grandparents would come in and talk to the school about this. And my parents never did that, right? When you called my house, my grandma would pick up. My grandma spoke 5 languages, and she was learning English, but she spoke with a broken English. And so how could this kid coming from this like zip code inside this apartment be able to compete with his fellow students? And when Ty shared his story, I realized that I wasn't smart. I was brown in America. And, the idea of when we share our stories in silos, it doesn't allow us to reflect on our history. It doesn't let me know that, like, I've heard the stories of missionaries helping the refugees come in. And I'm indebted to my ESL teacher, Mrs. Hill, even though I was born here. Mrs. Hill taught my cousins that were 12 years older all the way to my age. And Mrs. Hill was in her 80s, right? They formed a relationship. What I didn't know until like about 4 years ago or 3 years ago were that it was Black Americans. When 60% of Americans didn't want us inside this country, it was Black American civil rights leaders that fought for the inclusion with a New York Times ad, right? And so these stories allow us to kind of understand why we are here, allows us to anchor ourselves, but then it also builds the confidence to ask your parents their stories. My parents are in their 60s now. My dad has never shared anything. It was a really hard time, and I've been persistent, and we've been talking. I also sweetened them up. I brought them to Philadelphia because there's a big Southeast Asian market, Cambodian market. It's amazing. Like, if you're ever there, it's an FDR park. And on that trip, I found out my dad's adopted parents were Sicilian because he came as an orphan, and that explained the pantry. Like, my dad never cooks for himself or cooks, but whenever he cooks, it's always like fried cutlets and marinara sauce. I was like, Dad, like, this would be important to know, you know? Oh, but, I heard another story from my mom, and our stories are filled with joy and disbelief. My mom took care of my grandmother. My grandmother was too old when she came here to work, right? She went through genocide. They all did. My grandma, the pictures of her from back then, is unrecognizable. She looks like a stick. She is all skin and bones. And my grandma is larger than life. And my mom had to stop working to take care of my grandmother because she was the youngest. and everyone else had families. And when my grandma got better, 6 months later, my mom goes goes back to work, to the cult building, and she tells the person there she can't find her time card. And they're looking at her in disbelief, like, you've been gone 6 months, your time card's not going to be here. And my mom's like, well, can you make a new one? So they did. And she started working again, right? And she laughs. She was like, I didn't know that I could, like, be gone for I didn't know I would be fired for not showing up, you know? And so you get these stories, but I think the most important story, and it starts with a story that's traumatic. I want to share it if I have permission here. Do I have permission to share the story? Yeah. So in my family, the eldest, like myself, takes care of our youngest when our parents aren't there. I took my siblings to concerts, I did all their conferences. I brought them to school, helped them pack for college. I asked why my grandmother raised her siblings when she had an older sister. My mom shares the story about my great aunt and how my great aunt lives in a remote village, but she was a wealthy farmer. And so she had people that worked for her. And so that's why my grandmother ended up taking care of her kids. And the story goes like this. The Khmer Rouge comes into power, and they take gold and silver from everyone. They bring you to the center of the town. They say, give us everything. My brother-in-law has always been jealous of her wealth. And so he goes and tells the Khmer Rouge that my great aunt is hiding things. So they killed my great aunt that day. My great grandmother sees the whole thing. And she is killed too. My mom's nephew is there, and he is about a year younger. He's probably 11. And one of the neighbors grabs him and covers his mouth. And he survives everything. Fast forward to Connecticut, and then about 20 years ago, my mom is in Darien, Connecticut, and she's at this small house, this small temple. And she sees this woman with pointy earrings. It's a peculiar type of earring, and my mom starts a conversation with her. Sister, where are you from? And they start talking about their life here. And my mom's like, are you from this village? And she goes, how did you know? My mom shared that she used to spend her summers there. And that these summers were wonderful times, right? You were on this big place. And the woman was like, well, what are the names of your grandparents? Or like your family members? My mom shares her aunt's name, her grandmother's name, and this woman turns white. And rumor was that she ended up selling everything and moving to California afterwards. So in the time of calling cards, my mom had a phone call with her nephew. And she was like, I met this woman, this is her name, do you know her? And her nephew tells her, yes, they participated in our family's deaths. And I remember feeling so angry. And I heard the story last summer. I remember feeling so angry, so hurt. And I didn't know where to begin. And I didn't know why I felt so hurt at that moment. But trauma, the war felt so close, and I think that's what war does, and that's what trauma does. It makes it feel closer, where you could be generations removed, and it will still sting. And, my parents see it as a different life, a different time. People had to survive, and sometimes it was easier to go with the abusers, right? And I couldn't imagine their 4 years living under that, or what it would feel like for others who live under 400 years of racial violence. And, the positive part of the story was after the story was shared, I learned the names of my grandparents. I was able to trace, because genocide takes everything away. I was able to learn that we had electricity, that we had land, and my grandmother was a jet setter. I was able to learn that I could trace my lineage back to a great-great-grandfather. And I can't tell you how much that made me felt like I belonged to something larger. And I know that's not common for, it's common for some people where they can trace their ancestry back to the Pilgrims. But for others, especially from war, from slavery, there's just so far back that we can trace. And when I got that piece of me, I felt a little bit more whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all again for listening and joining us today. Thank you so much, Mike and Betty, for sharing your stories and your perspectives, kind of rooted in your own lived experience with the work that you're doing. Originally, I think we wanted to just kind of have a conversation amongst the three of us, but given the amount of time we have, I think we would love to kind of hear from you all. If you all have any questions, I think there will be mics passed around for audience questions. I did want to say, one common thread I've heard in our conversations is how stories of individual struggles and trauma are often kind of reflects larger systemic issues. And we've heard a great deal of that today, whether it's about kind of racial discrimination, racial violence, ageism, other ethnocentrism, the ways we kind of value our we see others who don't look like us, who are a different kind of part of their life journey, if you will, and the ways in which we share our stories to signal some type of collective action. It allows us to come together and to recognize that we're not alone, which is something that I've heard today. And also, I think something that's incredibly important and something I emphasize in my own work is the power of agency. So people having the right to tell their story on their own terms, tell stories how they feel resonates with who they are, resonates most with their communities, and also stories that are authentic and honest to their hardships and lived experiences. And I think that's something that's incredibly important and valuable in this conversation. So do we have any audience questions? There's one. Your hand shot up like a cannon. Yeah, There's a microphone coming your way.
That was wonderful sharing. Thank you. There's so much there, and I'm engaging in a storytelling project, so that's why I'm here to learn. So one question, you asked us permission to tell your story in that moment, a very painful and important story. I'd like you to share, why did you ask us for permission to tell your story? What was going on? Because that was important in some way that I didn't fully understand.
When my mom shared that story, I wasn't expecting it. I heard it recorded, and I was about to cry, and I was driving. And I hate when my parents see me cry, cause and but I didn't want people here to walk away hearing that story without giving permission, because it's a lot. There's a lot to hold on to. And I think, yeah. So it was asking permission so you wouldn't have to carry that weight of knowing something that I feel is heavy, right? And I know that oftentimes when people hear a story, they share a story. And so I want to, if that story is shared, I do want people that hear that story to ask permission to share it with others before they hear it. If that makes sense.
To help us prepare ourselves.
Yeah.
You're helping us prepare ourselves
Yep.
for something big.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Arden Santana. I'm an educator, a recovering public school teacher who has gone at lengths to, at this point, found my own school, focusing on civic literacy and advocacy. Mike, thank you for your vulnerability. And I just wanted to comment that, sometimes we get so wrapped up in our own trauma and experiences that today I'm even shocked at feeling like I learned to recognize or realize that other people of color are having these same traumatic generational experiences that are taking us there, So I feel compelled to connect with each of you on deep levels because of my work as an educator, and also as 1/3 of an organization called the Elements of Abundance, who are community and cultural architects and curators doing things at this point in our hometown of Connecticut, but now internationally. Miss Betty, I need to meet with you about AARP and those types of things. And my question is particularly for Aya. I apologize for being late, so I may have missed this answer, actually. But I'm curious to know, one, am I right in that your research has found that the trauma story is one that students don't want to tell anymore unless they can do it on their own terms in a way that incorporates their challenges and their wins and not the trauma. Is that right? And secondly, do you have any, does your data reflect or your research how the institutions are responding to these newfound written essays? And this is coming from a place I'm actually on track to apply to law school. And your talk reminded me going back to when I applied to college. And, you know, I had to tell my trauma story. And it's like, okay, what about my merit? You know, so this is a valuable conversation as an educator, as someone working with colleges. How are their essays being received in terms of admissions?
Thank you so much for those questions. Yeah, so to answer your first question, so what I am finding is students are adamant about rejecting the trauma narrative and being reduced to their most painful parts of their identity and lived experiences. Also, I have students who say, both of my parents are doctors, my grandparents are doctors, my great-grandparents were actually physicians as well. I don't have this trauma story you assume I have because of my racial identity as well, right? So you do see this confrontation of racial stereotypes. The assumption is my dad is locked up or my mom is a single parent, etc. So what I am seeing are students be more articulate and even having the level of self-awareness. I think it's a generational thing. I mean, they were incredibly insightful and could articulate very clearly that I am not telling you my struggle or trauma, right? So to answer your first question, yes, that is what I am seeing. For this second part of your question, it's a great one. So because of time, I didn't go into the depth of my research, but I also interview admissions officers at private universities across the country. So I have this admissions officer data where I ask them, is this what you want to read? And I'll say shameless plug, 2 weeks ago, I published an op-ed in The Atlantic about some of the unintended consequences of the Supreme Court banning affirmative action. And I used some of the admissions officers' data to kind of talk about what that could look like. So please look out for that. But nevertheless, so what I'm hearing on the admissions officer side is it's actually quite ambivalent, right? So on one hand, they say, we don't want to read the trauma. We don't want you to feel forced to share or disclose that. However, they say when you do share, it actually provides valuable data for us. Because if you talk about this hardship, I can then take that into consideration and advocate for you on the inside. So on one hand, they say they don't want you to feel forced. So speaking of the agency point, they don't want anyone to say, Betty, you must talk about your trauma. Mike, you must talk about your trauma. They say if you give it to us, though, we will take it into consideration as we make decisions. I do think once we receive the decision from the Supreme Court, things are going to get stickier, right? Because universities and institutions won't be able to legally consider race in the college admissions process. However, there are several racial proxies that we already use, right? Zip code, right? We talked about that, high schools. And then I think additionally, the essay is going to be another place where racial identity and racialized experiences will be disclosed, and that universities are going to have to try to navigate how can we create this racially diverse class that we insist we want without violating, the law, right? And constitutional law. So I'm not sure if that answered your second question. Did that provide some insight there? Yes, that's exactly right. So, I mean, I think universities are going to have to restructure questions that they ask. I think that's going to be a next step. I interviewed an admissions officer, I can't name the institution, but a very highly selective institution, and said they are already thinking about how to ask different types of questions to solicit different types of information because they do believe that the Supreme Court is going to rule affirmative action unconstitutional. Thank you for that question. Hello. So, hi. So you said, say that one more time. That's a fantastic question. I am still writing the dissertation, so I have not been able to dive into that. Yes, but I do collect data about gender. I collect data of whether or not my students are first-generation college students or not, because I wanted to see if there was that socioeconomic piece of that. I will say preliminarily, I have not seen differences across gender lines. I have seen more so class and socioeconomic lines, for a host of reasons that, we may already know. So yes, but I'm looking forward to diving into to see if there's gender differences and the ways students feel compelled to tell their stories in the dissertation project. So I'll check back in a year, and I'll have that ready for you. Did you have a question? Oh, wait.
Hello, my name's Steve. I'm sorry I just came in, so I missed a lot of the presentation. But in speaking about affirmative action, which may become unconstitutional, I wonder, in my mind, what the biggest source of affirmative action is: legacy. And I wonder whether there'll be any impact on that. Affirmative action has become, I guess, a dirty word when people who are not white are admitted. But to me, legacy, and we certainly understand it here in a community like New Haven, is the biggest source of affirmative action. I wonder, in your conversations maybe with admissions offices, whether who's going to take that into account, or whether there'll be any challenge to that. I mean, I can tell you stories too of admission officers who, like John F. Kennedy Jr., how he got into Brown and so forth. I mean, not by what he submitted, but by who he was. So to me, that's what affirmative action is, a very much legacy.
Yes, so, Jared Kushner, we'll be here all day, right? Rattling off names of folks who've benefited from their class privilege and legacy admission statuses. It's legacy admissions and also white women who are beneficiaries of affirmative action overwhelmingly. It's interesting enough, that did not come up in our conversation about dismantling affirmative action. And to your point, it has become a dirty word. And oftentimes, affirmative action means Black and Latinx students who did not deserve to be at an institution got a spot over another student, assumed to be white, who deserved it, right? So oftentimes, I don't even think the legacy admissions piece even comes up, and when you're talking to folks about affirmative action, because it goes directly into racialized minorities taking someone else's spots. And there's this entitlement, if you will, that says because my mom or dad or grandparent donated this building, or, they paid their dues, right? Or my mom or dad went here for or grandparents, multi-generational, that they paved the way for us. So I still am entitled to it. So I also think there's an entitlement that legacy admissions has, that people don't make that same consideration. There's an assumption that even if mom and dad helped them get there, they still had the basic qualification. They still had this basic merit. And unfortunately, racially minoritized students are not given that same grace. The assumption is they did not have the grades or the test scores. They took someone else's spot. I do think, though, as the Supreme Court, as we wait patiently for the decision, at least I am, that legacy admissions, that conversation is going to go straight to the top of the discourse, because I think it's finally, we need to have it. They talked about it during the oral arguments. I'm not sure if you listened to the oral arguments in October, but there was a discussion with the justices about legacy admissions. But, people are not suing, or not creating legal cases around legacy admissions just yet. But soon come, I believe. We have time for one more? Okay.
Hi. I had a lifetime of experience working at Yale University, primarily with undergraduates. So over a course of time, a lot of what you were talking about was, okay, we have to tell our trauma story to those students who are saying, enough. I want to tell you who I am. And just to see the changes over time, it really has been a terrific experience, when taking ownership. And, where those microaggressions that occur, it's like, no, I'm not going to take it anymore, and being able to stand up for themselves. So I have to say, I told my trauma story as I went to school as an older adult. And that was, to me, it was a strategic thing to do, is to say, this is where I'm coming from and this is where I am now. So that's part of the story. And your story in particular reminded me of an event that was held at Yale University that I was involved with. A Cambodian refugee student arranged for Margaret Cho to come and speak at Yale. And her comment was, my parents are going to be pleased because I finally went to Yale. So that kind of story. And thank you, Betty. She's been a mentor for me with AARP. Disrupt Aging is such a real powerful thing to do, is to change how people think about you. I'm on our tech team for AARP, and there's always this assumption that older folks know nothing about technology, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Up until a couple of months ago, one of our key tech people was 90 years old. He could teach the course, never mind, participating in it. So we need to be questioning our assumptions. And the same thing is with the workforce. There's those who will assume that you're older, that you don't know how to do something, or that you're younger and you don't know how to do something. And really, a team approach where intergenerational is included really is for the best. So no per question, but just a comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time now. Thank you all so much for coming. Let's give everyone a round of applause.